So he was living in a time in Russia where he was imprisoned and abused, and people were at a very high level of intellect then. The Russian scientists of the olden days, I mean, they were so smart and so communist, right? So he wrote a lot about emotions and intellect, and he said a lot of life is actually learning how to control and change your emotions and change the way your mind thinks. So he wrote in a mimer in the 30s, and that's where we're going to read text number 10.
Emotions and intellect are substantively different from one another. Emotions are rooted in and are entirely about self-interest. It is impossible for an emotion such as love or fear to develop in the absence of self-interest. True intellect, by contrast, involves the abnegation and transcendence of self-interest.
Okay, so this is what he defines. You have in Hebrew what's called midos, and you have what's called seichel, intellect and emotions. And he says, actually, and this is all over Hasidism, they're actually opposites. Emotions, by definition, start with a feeling. In order to have a feeling, someone has to feel it. There has to be an I feel it, right? No one can tell you what to feel. No one can tell you what not to feel. No one can tell you what you feel you don't feel, or what you don't feel you feel. Feelings are all about self-interest. It's how you feel in that moment, or how you feel about that thing, right? Emotions, by definition, are subjective. Intellect, actually, what it's meant to be, is meant to lift you out of yourself and see things objectively. That is ideally the nature of emotions versus intellect. So, for example, if 2 + 2 = 4 or not, is that a feeling, or is that an objective reality? Well, so as far as we humans can get, we're going to call it objective reality. I don't want to get into that subject because that can go on forever. But we have intellect is ideas which are objective. That is what the previous Rebbe is defining ideas which are objective. And emotions are subjective feelings, right? So is pizza tasty? Well, in Hebrew we say al tam v'reach ein litvakeach. On a taste and a smell you can't debate. Everyone has the right to like pineapples on their pizza or not, right? We all have the right to have feelings about whatever we want, and no one can take that away from us. Intellect has an idea of right and wrong, has an idea of a system. Yes, so, what were you going to say?
Well, on the one hand, we're talking about humility and wisdom, and then on the other hand, we're talking about emotions and intellect.
Okay,
So are we equating?
well, what we're going to say is, okay, so let me go into a little bit more. If you are truly objective and a true intellectual, you should actually become humble, right? Because if you're truly objective, then you don't really matter in the big picture, right? If you're able to leave the subjective point of what you need and what you feel, right? So then you'll become humble. There's a statement in Hebrew that says, Kol gei shoita. Anyone who's not humble is a fool, right? And anyone who's very smart, truly intellectual, is very humble. So I know we have a lot of people with high IQs, which are not humble, but usually, always, it's because their intellect is colored by feelings. They want something and they're using their intellect to get it. They're convincing people with brilliant ideas to give them what they want, right? That's usually those types of intellectuals. A true intellectual should be only looking at the greater picture. So if you have intellect, it likely may get colored by feelings. You may come to wrong conclusions. All right, yeah.
To me, you're describing a scientist, not a leader. And there's a huge difference there. This person is not someone who I think would have the strength, the shoulders to lead for people, because he would just be easily overridden.
Yeah, well, we'll get back to Saul, but yeah, it's a given, right? If you are totally an intellectual, maybe you won't do anything. You'll just be thinking the whole day. But we're not going to say you're wrong. Your ideas aren't wrong. Your ideas are probably more objective than someone who needs,
But not, as Ed used the word strength, and I was thinking that that also. I didn't get a feeling of any strength there that people would respect. There's no respect.
Well, okay, so we'll get to humility soon. So actually, you might want to call this the difference between smart versus wise. Smart means you have great tools over here to get whatever you're trying to get or do whatever you're trying to do, right? Wise might be you're trying to reach higher. You're trying to be understanding of reality, a deeper understanding of reality, perhaps a more objective understanding of reality. So yes, we are going to see now that King Saul was extremely humble and extreme intellectual. But these were the causes of his downfall. These were the causes of his downfall. And what could Saul have done in order to fix that? Because, everyone suffers from it nowadays. We see it so strongly in the world. You have brilliant people, right? So you have some brilliant people who just want to read books the whole day, right? And then you have some brilliant people, they come up with plans and they convince people and they come up with ingenious plans and ingenious ideas only to get what makes them feel good, right? So their intellect is colored by feelings and they're going to go off eventually because they're not being objective to the right thing. So now we will talk about, and let's go back into Jewish monarchy and we will, start tying this up. Yeah.
That's a quick question, and sorry, it's a bit of a detour, but Samuel, how would he be described? Would he be described as humble?
We'll talk about Samuel at the end. Samuel's special. Okay. So here, this first point is something we spoke about in lesson number 1, if you remember last week. We spoke about how Yiftach tried to do the right thing, and it made sense to him, but humans are subjective. And we spoke about that's why you need a mentor or friend to speak things out, because humans are almost always subjective. I mean, you wouldn't know if you're subjective or not. So that's what we spoke about Yiftach. Another thing that we need to remember is our intellect is always vulnerable to not being objective. Intellect is vulnerable. There might be variables you're unaware of. There might be details you don't know. So Saul may have been very, very smart, maybe very, very smart, but we can see perhaps he was relying on his intellect a little bit too much. And we're going to see more, and we have to ask ourselves, how do we safeguard our intellect and our humility? Because, no matter how smart we get, we can always end up following our emotions and not realizing it, not realizing we lost our objectivity. So how do we do it? And that's what we're going to discuss now. We're going to now get back into humility, and we're going to see. So again, what we just summarized. If you're truly intellectual, you will be humble, right? Because humility has to do with what you think about yourself, right? And the more intellectual you are, the more there is, the less you think about yourself, right? Okay, so now let's go back to the mitzvah of king, and we're going to read back and see how the Torah is laying out what a king needs and how Saul was almost there and where things got messed up. Okay, so text number 11.
The purpose of appointing a king is so that through him the nation is subservient to God. For the nation by law is subservient to the king and must obey all his decrees, and the king himself is subservient to God. By extension, the people are subservient to God.
Okay, so this is really, really important. This is a really important detail in King. So what we said is humility, and I didn't focus on it. So intellect, we said, if you are just relying on your intellect, what happens is true intellect has to have a disinterested mind. You have to have no agenda. It's like if you want to be a judge, right? You can't be bribed by any emotions or any feelings. But sometimes you lose it, and you end up being bribed. You end up your intellect goes off. Humility. If you have humility, here are the drawbacks. You might have insecurity, low self-confidence. You might have indecisiveness. How do I know? Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, right? So these are two things that Saul kind of questioned. He questioned he took in pressure from other people because he was so humble. Okay, now, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, in the book of Commentary on Mitzvahs, he talks about the mitzvah of a king, and he goes through the verses in detail. He says, why do Jewish people want to have a king? Why is it good to have a king? Because Jewish people have to follow God. So if you have a representative of God who's in charge of the Jewish people, and he follows God, and we follow him, then who will we be following? God, right? That is the purpose. He uses the word batel, actually. This is a similar word for those of you who want to know about the idea of a chassid and a rebbe. The rebbe system came out like that. People said, I want to live my whole life following God. So if there's a rabbi who represents God, and we submit ourselves, right, just like the Torah wants to submit ourselves to a king, then essentially we'll always be following God. So, why does Judaism want a king? This is what we're going to talk about now. Judaism wants us to have a king because a king has to always have a Torah. He's meant to be representative of God, always feeling he's in God's presence. And we are going to be under the king, submit ourselves to the king, so we're also following God's presence. Okay, so now we're going to explain, when we get back to a king, yeah.
But no human being can be like God. All human beings are frail, are incompetent,
There's one exception. Someone who's chosen by God to do the job.
but he's still a human being.
Correct, he's still a human
He's not
being.
the Messiah.
So
He's
what,
still a human
well,
being.
the Messiah, right, is a human being. But he's chosen by God. In other words, he doesn't choose to be the Messiah. God chooses him. He's a human being, that's right. His whole submission to God is not his own. It's God's. He's not perfect. God is perfect. God chose him. His perfection is not his own. His perfection is God's. He doesn't have any perfection on his own. Going back, mention about Moses. So Moses was the most humble. How could he say he was most humble? Well, Moses had a very simple realization. What he made him the greatest leader in Jewish history was not his own. It was God's, right? It was God's gift to him. In fact, Moses would say, hey, I didn't do anything. If it was given to that person over there, they might even do a better job than me. So that's right what you're saying. We cannot choose to be king. God has to choose the king. He chooses the prophets, he chooses the kings, because we cannot attain perfection of God. Only when God chooses someone can they carry the godly energy, the godly power. So it's the same thing with the king. So now here we're going to just talk about democracy versus Jewish monarchy. Now we spoke earlier. We said the purpose of, kings would be to make a unified system, right? In Judaism, so democracy is when we elect people to follow public opinion. They are your representative, right? In Judaism, they're not our representative. What are kings? They're God's representative. They're God's representative. That's what Moses is saying in the Torah. He's saying there will come a time when you'll have a king that will be God's representative to you. So, what happened is twice, Saul followed the people instead of following the prophet of God. The prophet of God told him to do one thing, and he fell into pressure of the people. So this is what we're dealing with now. So we all make mistakes. Saul made some mistakes, but essentially his mistakes were the exact opposite of the purpose of a king. The purpose of a king is someone who's so observant to God and so careful to follow God that he's a role model, and people know when they're following him, who are they following? You see, humans, we're all subjective, and it's hard for us to always get a full picture of how to follow God because we're so subjective. When we have a king, right, and a representative of God, he can guide us. But Saul's mistakes ended up causing him to follow the people. And so these were Saul's mistakes. So this is really the answer to Saul's problem. Saul was meant to be the representative of God. So what does a king really have to work on? He always has to be asking himself, what does God want? Because I am connecting the people, right? People are going to be serving me. They're going to be serving God, right? That's my purpose. Not because I'm smart, not because I'm humble. So Saul was extremely humble. He was extremely smart. But he had forgotten about God. He had forgotten about his purpose. He had forgotten about how everything he does is only there. All his abilities are only there for God. So you know what? When you're following God, there's a time to be humble. And there's a time to stand up for what's right. Because it doesn't matter what you want. It matters what God wants. God, you're standing up for God. And the same thing, there's a time to be intellectual, but there's a time to remember, in the end of the day, I'm here representing God. I'm here, I need to follow God. So that was Saul's mistake. His subservience came from his own trait. His humility was his own trait. He didn't have it connected with God. Yeah.
Were the people under him also wanting to honor God rather than?
Okay, great. So this was what happened in the conversation we asked in the beginning between Samuel and God. The people come to Samuel and they say, give us a king like the other nations. Like the other nations. Why do other nations have kings? Do they have a mitzvah to have a king? They can have a republic. They can have whatever they want. They do it in order to have a good society. The Jewish people were suffering. They were struggling in Israel, and they came to Samuel. And they said, give us a king to tie things together. We need to fight wars against our enemies. Like the other nations, we need someone to unite us so we will be a successful country. Samuel looked at them and said, oy vey. Like other nations. That's not why Moses said to have a king. That's not why Moses said to have a king. God comes to Samuel and he says, look, if they ask for it, give it to them. They'll learn this way. They'll learn what a king really is. If they ask them, it's still a mitzvah technically, but it's for the wrong reason. And that's why Samuel was so upset. He said, people want a governor. They're not realizing the purpose of a king is to submit yourself to God through submitting yourself to the king who always goes around with the Torah and he knows he's following God's will. So that is the answers to our question. And actually, we'll read text 12. Text 12, you'll see, it'll spell it out quite clearly.
Samuel was displeased because they requested a king who would govern us like all the nations.
So that's what we just said. That was the problem. So if you were Saul, what you would realize is God would say, well, you're very humble. And you're very smart. You would say, boy, I really need to use these traits to follow God and listen to God and become a new person. And now when God needs me to stand up strong, I'll stand up strong because I'm representing him. Okay, now that's the end of that lesson. We're going to go into the lesson for us. We're going to talk about how the human builders and what that means to us. So just to kind of summarize, we explained how humility comes from disconnecting from what you want, the importance on what you want and what you feel. The more objective you are, the more humble you are. And that's why Saul was so humble. He had such a broad mind. The problem is you still have to submit yourself to God. Humility on its own is not enough because you might be humble in the wrong times, right? You might be humble in the wrong times. Or you might use your intellect in the wrong place. Your intellect will serve your other needs, emotions, or whatever it is. However, when God is on top, and when you realize, no, my main purpose is to follow God, then the humility has a context, and the mind has a context and knows where I need to follow. This is what I want to do, and this is how I'm going to follow it. Okay, so now we're going to go in, and now we'll get to the lesson for us, and we'll finish off for today. So that is the story of Saul, and again, we summarized why the people wanted a king like all the other nations. But God wants in the Torah, and Moses said, you need a king to advance in your Yiddishkeit, and a king to know how to serve God. If you're under the king, you will become closer to God. Okay, let's go on, and now we'll read text 13. This is obviously Rab Nassan, which is a very famous old commentator on the Pirkei Avot.
With his wisdom and understanding, the Holy One, blessed be he, and blessed forever is his great name, created the entire universe, the heavens and the earth, the upper and lower realms. He also fashioned the human being as a microcosm of the entire universe. In the world, God created the notion of a king. In the human being, the king of the body is the head.
All right, this is great. Okay, so second. Well, this is just summarizing wisdom, humility, and security. God, humility, responsibility, right? If you have God on top, then you will come to responsibility and purpose. Okay, so, sorry, I missed these. Okay, here we have what we just said. What is the king of the human, of your own self? So, obviously, Rab Nassan says, the king is your head. If you look in the Zohar, it says, what is the word for king in Hebrew? Anyone remember? Melech. Melech stands for Moach, Lev, Kaved. The head comes first, the brain comes first, the mind. Lev is the heart, and liver is the kaved. It filters out the blood. This represents action. And it says the king has all these faculties, and the head has to be on top of the heart. Like a lot of us, the heart is on top of the head, right? The head has to be, a lot of times, whatever we figure out is what feels good to our heart, right? So king has to know first his head, then his heart, and then his action. So this is what a king is. We always have to know that our intellect has to be on top of our emotions. That is, now, interestingly enough, if you put the heart on top, it spells lemech. Lemech means a fool, right? So intellect has to be on top. Now the thing is we'll explain soon that intellect, this is where a king starts, but he has to even start before that, we'll mention soon. So now let's go on to the next one. Now this is very, very interesting. This is from the Maharsha, from the 16th century. So he says something about dogs, really interesting. Oh, yeah.
Okay. It would appear that the Hebrew word kelev, which means dog, is derived from the fact that the dog is kulo lev, all heart.
All right, so dogs, right? The Maharsha says, dogs, why are they called kelev? Because they are kulo lev. They're all heart. Dogs are all heart. Dogs are all instinct. They have no brains, right? Well, maybe they have a brain, right? Anyone here like cats, dogs, right? Okay. So what essentially is he saying? Dogs follow instinct. They follow emotion. In fact, that's why people love dogs so much. There's a lot of people who can't get along with humans, by the way, but they can get along with a dog. Dogs are always loyal. Even if you're bad to them, they're loyal. They love you. They're all heart, right? They're all heart. Humans, they have this problem. They have brains, right? They have the mind. So now we find it actually in mysticism. It says that. Oh, sorry about that. So lemech is a fool. Okay. So dogs. We can see those are the words. All heart. So dogs, their head is on the same level as their emotions, and pretty much all animals are like that, except for humans and kangaroos. But kangaroos also can go down, right? Better than us, right? So kangaroos are indeed an anomaly in that. But anyways, humans, their mind is on top of their emotions. All our humans have that. What do we do when we want something really badly and we can't get it? We start thinking about reasons. Oh, I'm going to convince you, right? And the reasons are so charged. We're so powerful about it. You know, a lot of times people come to me and they'll be like, you know, you have to do this or that, and I'll be like, oh, well, let's discuss it next week. And then next week, it's like they don't care about it anymore. It's like, oh, well, let's wait till next year, till you know. So this is the way. So for humans, when we let our emotions rule, then we'll totally go off. And a lot of times we do that, and we spoke about last week. The way to not do that is to have a mentor or a friend to speak to. But as humans, if we only consider our emotions, we'll end up getting in conflicts with people. And as we said before, you have to be wise rather than smart. Wise is sometimes looking at the big picture, being able to look at the big picture and seeing what is right or how does that person see it. A lot of times, wise people can look at something the way someone else sees it, and smart people simply can't. They're only working on their agenda. Wisdom spawns humility, and humility in relationships is when we're able to give a space for somebody else. So that is number one, why Saul was chosen as king, right? And so we'll give Saul a break for now. His wisdom was above his emotions. He was able to see the greater picture further than what he wanted, what he needed, and that's why he was so humble. Okay, now we have to talk a little bit more about personal monarchy. As we said, it's not enough to just follow your emotions and intellect. It's not enough to follow your emotions and intellect. So now we'll read from King David in the Psalms. Page 62, text 15.
15.
Okay, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. All who observe his commandments have sound intelligence. Their praise endures forever.
So this is out from King David in Psalms. So the beginning of wisdom is fear of God, right? What is that? The beginning of wisdom is wisdom, right? Well, this is how God wanted Saul and wants us to view our intellect and our emotions. God wants us to first know that the first thing is we're here for a purpose, to follow God. We're here for a purpose to follow God. And that's what King David was actually exemplary on. He knew that his wisdom might be faulty and that his emotions might be faulty. And you see this again and again in the Psalms. The first thing we have to know is we're here for a purpose. God put us here for a purpose. He needs us to do something here. We didn't just wake up one morning. And when we know we have a purpose from God, God will be central in our life. And when God is central, then we'll know that our intellect isn't there and our emotions aren't there to get things we like. And our intellect isn't there in order to create a better world or something that we like. Our intellect there is a tool to use to get closer to God. A tool to use to get closer to God. And when we view our intellect and our attributes that way, and everything that we have is really a tool to get closer to God, and a tool that God gave us to fulfill our mission for Him, then we will be able to fulfill our mission in the world, fulfill the purpose of our intellect and our emotions, and not make the mistakes that Saul made. So just to summarize, Saul, just to point out, he was like so brilliant, and he was so humble, but he forgot he's there representing God. He's there for a purpose. He doesn't have these skills because he's endowed. He has these skills because God gave it to him for a purpose. He has to use them in their right context. And sometimes he'll have to stand up strong, and he'll seem out of his personality. And sometimes he can be humble. So at the end it has an exercise you're welcome to do. One area in our life that can be improved by making my mind a master of my emotions. And one area of my life that I would benefit from recognizing God as a master of intellect. So just to share just a couple of quick anecdotes, and then we'll watch the summary of this, and then that's it for today. There was a story there's a story that they say that there was a certain big dispute in Russia about which knife to slaughter an animal with. Anyways, there was the Hasidim were always known to be exceedingly humble. So there was a big dispute. The Hasidim were for the high holidays with the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the third Lubavitcher Rebbe noted to this town. They said the ritual slaughterer, the shochet of that town, doesn't use this material blade, and this type of blade you have to sacrifice your life to make sure they do the right thing. Otherwise, the kashrus of the meat will be questionable. Anyways, the Hasidim came back